You know what bothers me more than almost anything in woodworking? A wobbly chair. You can build a beautiful tabletop. You can hand-cut dovetails that make people stop and stare. But if you build a chair and it starts rocking and creaking after a couple of years, none of that matters. I struggled with chair joints for a long time. Glue, dowels, even mechanical fasteners. Nothing seemed to hold up the way I wanted. Then about 8 years ago, I visited a chair maker down in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. He was working under a simple open-air shelter, no electricity, no fancy tools, just a shaving horse, a draw knife, and a pile of freshly split green wood. And the chairs he was building were identical in method to ones I'd seen in a museum that were over 150 years old and still solid as the day they were made. No glue, no screws, no wobble. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how Appalachian chairmakers build a ladder-back chair that will genuinely outlive the person who makes it. And stick around to the end because I'll share a fitting technique I learned from that chairmaker that completely changed how I think about round tenons. Let's get into it. The Appalachian ladderback chair is one of the most refined examples of practical furniture engineering in American history. And what makes it remarkable isn't complexity. It's the opposite. These chair makers figured out how to use the natural behavior of wood, its tendency to shrink, swell, and move, as the primary fastening system. Once you understand the thinking, you'll start seeing opportunities to use these principles in all kinds of projects beyond chairs. So let me give you some background on who these makers were and why their approach deserves serious attention. The ladderback chair tradition in Appalachia goes back to the 1700s, carried into the mountains by Scots-Irish and English settlers who adapted old-world stick chair traditions to the timber they found in the southern highlands. These weren't furniture makers in the way we think of the word today. They were farmers, mostly, who made chairs in the off-season as a source of trade and income. A good chairmaker could turn out 2 or 3 chairs a day working by hand, and the chairs would be traded at the general store or sold to neighbors for a few cents apiece. What's important to understand is that these people had almost no access to hardware. Nails were expensive. Glue was unreliable in an unheated cabin, and the nearest sawmill might be a 2-day ride on horseback. So they developed a construction system that relied entirely on the wood itself. The forests around them were full of red oak, white oak, hickory, and ash, all of which split beautifully along the grain and had the mechanical properties needed for strong, lightweight furniture. The guiding principle behind everything they did was simple and brilliant. Green wood shrinks as it dries. Dry wood stays stable. If you put a dry tenon into a green mortise and then let nature take its course, the mortise shrinks around the tenon and locks it in place permanently. That is the secret. And everything else in the construction process is designed to support that one idea. Now let me walk you through how this actually works in practice, starting with how they get their wood out of the tree. The first thing that surprised me when I watched that Kentucky chairmaker work was that he never once touched a saw to break down his stock. He used an axe and a froe. Every single part of the chair, the legs, the rungs, the slats, was riven from a straight-grained log, meaning split along the natural fiber of the wood rather than sawn across it. This matters enormously, and here's why. When you saw a board, the blade cuts across wood fibers at whatever angle the grain happens to run. That means some of your fibers are severed, which creates weak points and gives moisture an easy path into the wood. But when you rive, you're following the grain exactly. Every fiber runs the full length of the piece, unbroken. The result is a part that's dramatically stronger for its weight and far more predictable in how it moves as it dries. The chairmaker I watched would start with a straight section of red oak log about 5 feet long and maybe 10 inches in diameter. He'd split it in half with wedges, then quarters, then keep halving the sections until he had billets, roughly 2 inches square. From those billets, he'd shape the legs and posts on the shaving horse. The rungs and slats came from smaller billets split from the same log or from white oak or hickory, depending on what was available. I tried riving for the first time on that trip, and the feeling of a fro popping open a clean split along perfect grain is something I'll never forget. The wood almost wants to come apart along that line, and the surfaces you get are far smoother than any bandsaw cut because the fibers are intact, not torn. Now here's the core of the whole system, the part that makes Appalachian chairs practically indestructible. The legs and posts are shaped while the wood is still green, meaning freshly cut, with a moisture content somewhere around 40 to 60%. The rungs, however, are made well in advance and allowed to dry completely. Some chairmakers would store their rungs behind the wood stove for weeks, getting them bone dry, down to maybe 6 or 8% moisture content. When it's time to assemble, the chairmaker bores a round mortise into the green leg using a spoon bit or a hand brace with an auger bit. That hole might be drilled at exactly 3/4 of an inch in diameter. The dry rung tenon is turned or shaved to fit that hole snugly, right at 3/4 of an inch, or maybe just a hair over. At assembly, the fit is tight but manageable. You can tap the joint home with a mallet without too much fuss. But here's where the magic happens. Over the next several weeks, as the green leg dries and loses moisture, it shrinks. Wood shrinks most across the grain, tangentially and radially, but very little along its length. Since the mortise hole runs across the grain of the leg, that hole is getting smaller as the leg dries. Meanwhile, the bone-dry rung tenon has already done all its shrinking. It's stable. So the green wood literally clamps down onto the dry tenon with tremendous force. The joint actually gets tighter with time. After a year, you could not pull that rung out without destroying the wood around it. No glue needed, no fastener needed. The wood is the fastener. When I first felt how tight those joints were on a chair that old chairmaker had built just a few months earlier, I understood immediately why these chairs survive for generations. Compare that to a modern factory chair where kiln-dried dowels are glued into kiln-dried legs. Everything is at the same moisture content. There's no differential shrinkage working in your favor. The glue is doing all the work, and when the glue eventually fails, and it does eventually fail, you've got a wobbly chair. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old-world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Old Ways, and it is a collection of 100 forgotten woodworking secrets from traditional craftsmen around the world. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The tool that makes all of this shaping possible is the shaving horse, and if you've never used one, you're missing out on one of the most satisfying woodworking experiences there is. A shaving horse is a simple, foot-operated clamping bench. You sit on it like a saddle, put your workpiece on the platform in front of you, press a foot pedal that clamps the piece tight, and then go to work with a draw knife. The Appalachian chairmakers could round a leg blank from a square riven billet to a finished tapered cylinder in about 10 minutes, using nothing but a draw knife and a shaving horse. The draw knife they favored was usually around 8 to 10 inches across the blade, with a gentle curve and handles angled slightly downward. You pull it toward your body, and with green wood, the shavings come off in long, clean ribbons. The control you have is remarkable. You can take off 1/8 of an inch in one pass, or a paper-thin shaving, just by adjusting the angle and pressure. For the legs, they'd taper from about 1 3/4 inches in diameter at the bottom to about 1 1/4 inches at the top where the finials are. The rungs were typically shaved to about 5/8 of an inch or 3/4 of an inch in diameter, depending on the size of the chair. Each rung end was carefully shaped to a consistent round tenon using the draw knife, and sometimes finished with a tenon rounder, which is basically a steel plate with a hole and a cutting edge that works like a giant pencil sharpener. What struck me watching this process was the speed and accuracy. This chairmaker wasn't measuring constantly. He was going by feel and by eye, checking diameters with his fingers, sighting down the length of a part to check for straightness. He'd been doing it so long that his hands knew what 3/4 of an inch felt like without a caliper. That kind of body knowledge only comes from repetition, and it reminded me that tools are important, but the real tool is the person using them. Now let's talk about how the actual joint goes together in more detail, because the specifics matter. The mortise in the green leg is bored at a specific angle, usually about 5 degrees off perpendicular, so that the rungs splay slightly outward. This gives the chair its characteristic stance and also adds structural rigidity by triangulating the forces. The mortise depth is typically about 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch deep, and the chairmaker is careful to bore it cleanly without blowing out the backside of the leg. The dry rung tenon is inserted, and the joint is tapped home. Some chairmakers add a small detail that makes the joint even more permanent. They'll cut a thin kerf, a saw cut, into the end of the tenon before assembly, and then insert a tiny dry wedge into that kerf from the outside after the tenon is seated. As the leg shrinks around the joint, it compresses that wedge and forces the tenon to expand slightly inside the mortise. You end up with a mechanical lock from 2 directions simultaneously, the leg squeezing inward and the wedge pushing the tenon outward. It's an elegant, simple solution that adds maybe 30 seconds of work per joint and makes failure nearly impossible. The front and rear legs are connected by rungs at multiple levels, usually 3 or 4 rungs on each side, plus the horizontal slats across the back that give the ladder back its name. Those slats are usually steam bent or shaved from green stock and bent over a form while still pliable. The curve adds spring and comfort to the backrest. When everything is assembled, the chair is left to dry slowly in a sheltered area, not in direct sun or near a heat source, which could cause the green wood to crack. Over a period of several weeks, all the joints tighten to their final state. Once the frame is solid, the seat gets woven, and this is another area where Appalachian chairmakers showed real ingenuity. The most traditional seat material is inner hickory bark, stripped from young hickory trees in the spring when the sap is running and the bark peels easily. The strips are about 1 inch to 1 1/2 inches wide and remarkably strong. They're woven in a simple over-under pattern across the front and side rungs, creating a seat that has just enough give to be comfortable but enough strength to support several hundred pounds. Where hickory bark wasn't available, chairmakers used white oak splints, which are thin strips pounded and peeled from a white oak log. The process of making splints is a whole craft in itself. You take a straight section of white oak about 4 to 6 inches in diameter, soak it or beat it with a mallet, and the annual growth rings separate into thin, flexible layers. Each layer becomes a splint that's woven into the seat. These seats conform to the sitter's body over time and can last decades with normal use. When they do eventually wear out, they can be rewoven without disturbing the chair frame at all. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for glue as the primary fastener for chair joints. Most of us do it because that's how we were taught and because modern wood glue is strong stuff. But the Appalachian approach shows that differential shrinkage creates a stronger and more durable connection than any adhesive, especially in a joint that has to withstand racking forces every time someone leans back. The second pattern is insisting on kiln-dried lumber for everything. I did this for years because I was afraid of wood movement. But these chairmakers taught me that green wood isn't a problem to be solved. It's a resource to be used. The movement is the mechanism. You just have to know which parts should be green and which should be dry. The third pattern is over-reliance on measuring tools during shaping. I'm not saying throw away your calipers. But watching a chairmaker shape a perfectly consistent tenon by feel, checking it against the mortise rather than against a number, taught me that fitting to the actual joint matters more than hitting an abstract dimension. The fourth pattern is building chairs with flat, rigid joints, like mortise and tenon joints cut square on a table saw. Those joints have no forgiveness. The Appalachian round mortise and tenon allows for slight adjustment during assembly, accommodates wood movement in every direction, and is far easier to execute accurately with simple hand tools. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is something that Kentucky chairmaker showed me, and I've used it on every round tenon joint I've made since. Before he assembled a rung into a leg, he would take the dry tenon and lightly scorch it over a candle flame. Not burn it, just warm it enough to drive out any residual surface moisture and slightly harden the outermost fibers. He told me it does two things. First, it ensures that tenon is as dry and small as it's ever going to be at the moment of assembly, which maximizes the shrinkage differential with the green leg. Second, the light charring creates a surface that's slightly rough at the microscopic level, which increases friction inside the mortise once the joint tightens. I was skeptical the first time I tried it, but I've since built several stools using this method, and the joints are noticeably tighter than the ones I assembled without scorching. It takes about 15 seconds per tenon with a simple candle. No special equipment. Just a small, quiet trick that makes a real difference. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best traditional woodworking methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called The Old Ways. 100 techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with step-by-step photos and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and if you want more of these deep dives, make sure to subscribe. I will see you in the next one.